All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the Penn Project on the Future of U.S. China Relations public lecture anticipating the Trump-Xi summit in Beijing. We're delighted to be able to collaborate today for this event with SNF Padea and then also with University of Pennsylvania's Government and Politics Association as part of their Government and Politics Week. Before I hand the mic over to their president, just wanted to highlight some upcoming events that our project has later this month. So on April 24th, we'll be welcoming Jonathan Chang to campus. He served as the Washington Street Journal's China Bureau Chief and has a new book coming out this month. And he'll be speaking on covering Trump and Xi, a journalist's perspective on the world's most consequential relationship. And then on April 28th, from 4:30 to 6 p.m., we'll welcome Kaiser Kuo, who's the founder of Sinica Podcast, to speak on One System, Two Civilizations, China, America, and the Struggle to Share the World. But before those events, today, anticipating the Trump-Xi summit in Beijing, and I'll hand it over to Ferenc Brezo, President of Government and Politics Association.
Thank you so much. And also thanks for everyone who came here as experts and also for the audience. Just a few words about our Government and Politics Week. So this is our inaugural week where we try to put basically governmental work and also policy in the focus of campus discussion. And we have a whole week and actually even more of events spanning from foreign policy, just like this, or the former Secretary of the Treasury coming to campus next week. So I hope that you visit our website or Instagram and you come to more of our events. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ferenc. And welcome everyone to this discussion. My name is Neysun Mahboubi. I'm the director of the Penn Project on the Future of U.S. China Relations, and we are really delighted to work with Ferenc and the Government and Politics Association and the SNF Padea program in order to put this panel together. So we have a number of our current and former fellows of the Penn Project on the Future of U.S. China Relations assembled on stage here for this discussion, anticipating the Trump-Xi summit. To be totally frank, when we first put this panel together, the original title was something like Reflecting on the Trump-Xi summit, because this was supposed to be the Tuesday right after the summit. Of course, we know that the summit was postponed, now scheduled for May 14th to 15th. So we very quickly changed the framing from reflecting on or assessing to anticipating. I think we should be at least open to the possibility that it may not happen May 14th to 15th. So as of right now, we are anticipating a summit that would be in about 6 weeks, but who knows? We know that this is a complicated time in the world and there's lots of things that are happening that may be beyond our ability to predict. All of that said, though, regardless of whether the summit does in fact take place, this is probably a good moment to take the temperature of the U.S.-China relationship in general and to use the possibility of a summit in May 14th, May 15th to make some comments across each of the issue areas that you see reflected here on stage about what may be in store for the U.S.-China relationship. Let me briefly introduce everyone who is here on stage, and then we will start the conversation. Directly to my left is Jake Werner. I'm the director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, one of our current project fellows. To his left is Maggie Jackson, also one of our current project fellows, who is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. To her left, Maggie Lewis, one of our original project fellows, professor of law at Seton Hall Law School. Then we have Rosie Levine, one of our second cohort project fellows, the executive director of the U.S. China Education Trust. And next to her, Carl Minzner, professor of law at Fordham Law School, also a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and one of our current project fellows. As I list their linealogy of what cohorts they are, I should mention that we are very close to selecting our fourth cohort of project fellows. And so in just a few weeks, Jake and Maggie and Carl will be alumni of the program as well, and we will be announcing our fourth cohort. So with all of that said, let's start the conversation. And I think I'm going to start with you, Jake, and ask you to reflect broadly on this moment in U.S.-China relations. Where Are we about a year and a half or so into the second Trump administration? Is it what you were expecting? Is it what generally we thought we would see in the second Trump administration? If not, what is it? And what do you think, if they proceed with this summit in May, what do you think that might portend for the U.S. China relationship in the near future?
Thank you, Neysun. Yeah, is it what I was expecting? I don't actually remember. It's hard to think back through all the crazy ups and downs in U.S. China relationship over the last year and a half to remember what I expected. I think to start out with, I was expecting that it could have gone in radically different directions, and it has. It has gone in a radically escalatory confrontational direction, and then we ended up in a trade truce after Liberation Day last year that almost blew up, but then was reestablished. So we have a very strong kind of roller coaster dynamic, escalatory cycles followed by de-escalatory cycles. And then where does that bring us today? Well, also difficult to tell. Obviously, if anyone missed this, the president of the United States threatened genocide against Iranian civilization today. And so in a context where that is possible, I think how to understand where the United States is going and how China will respond to that is really difficult to say. So I think maybe it would be useful to take a step back and think about where the foreign policy establishments of the two countries are at right now in response to this, because predicting what Trump is going to do is kind of a fool's errand. But more predictable is the more stable institutional structures of foreign policy making on the two sides. And I think that it's interesting because here you might expect that in both China and the United States, the foreign policy establishments would be reacting to what seems really fundamental changes in the U.S. government, in the global order, the ways in which Trump is attacking the global order and threatening to destabilize it. We haven't even considered the possibility of a global economic crisis that could come out of all of this, that could shake everything to its foundations. One of the interesting things for me is that does not seem to be happening. The kind of foreign policy worlds in the two countries, their assumptions, they're not really rethinking their assumptions. So, for example, on the U.S. side, the whole motivation, supposedly the whole motivation after the first Trump term, this kind of chaotic break with China, the consensus that emerged out of that is that we have to compete with China, quote unquote, compete with China, because China is threatening the rules-based international order. And so we have to stop that, just as we have stopped previous iterations of that from Iraq and North Korea and Sudan. So China kind of got lodged in that category of rogue states. We have to stop them from challenging the rules-based international order. Okay, in the last month, Trump has done more to destabilize the rules-based international order than China has done in the last 5 years. So where does that leave us? You would maybe expect people to say, okay, I'm going to have to rethink how I thought about the United States as the status quo country. I'm going to have to rethink how I thought about China as the one that was challenging the status quo. Now, China has actually been trying to keep the global order stable, more or less, while simultaneously insulating itself from the potential of attacks from the United States. So doesn't that force us to rethink the assumptions that brought us into the great power competition? You would think, no. I'm not really seeing that in the foreign policy world. There's no reconsideration. If anything, there is a kind of increasing anxiety that because Trump is not effectively competing with China, when we come back to power, right, when the foreign policy establishment once again controls foreign policy, we're going to have to compete even harder. And I think the thing for me that is really worrying about that is many of these people are looking at what Trump is doing. Trump is applying kind of nakedly coercive U.S. foreign policy in new ways. And what the foreign policy establishment might be learning out of this is that actually we could do that too. We thought we had to do this give and take with allies, that we couldn't force third countries to choose between the U.S. and China, that we couldn't just use the state to throw money everywhere and control critical minerals in the global south. But now we know we can do that. And it's even more urgent now that we've lost this foothold against China to do so when we come back. And at the same time on the Chinese side, you would again think that China is trying to maintain a stable global order. It sees its interests in sort of the free movement of goods and access to energy in the Middle East, for example, some kind of orderly trading system. These are fundamental to China's political economy. Well, the United States is destabilizing that. Is that going to survive the next couple of years? Shouldn't we be thinking about what might come after it, or what you would do to try to shore it up beyond simply defensive measures? That doesn't seem to be happening on the Chinese side either. So the interesting thing to me is that even as the entire order is being destabilized, the responses in both China and the United States are very conservative, very kind of not questioning self-conceptions or the assumptions they brought into these issues. And instead, they are really continue to focus on each other as the main threat to the other, and think about how they can prepare for what I think both sides expect to be a much sharper conflict on the other side of what happens with Trump. Now, that all assumes that we're more or less in the same spot that we are today, and I think we can assume that's not going to be the case. But we don't know what's going to happen over the next couple of years, and that I think will require close attention to see what the possibilities in the U.S.-China relationship are on the other side of the chaos.
Thanks, Jake. Let me ask you one follow-up before moving on to Maggie. So putting aside I think your initial point about the destabilizing effect of the current moment in this administration, putting that aside and just really focusing on the U.S.-China relationship. Toward the end of your remarks, it sounds like you're pretty pessimistic about the long-term trajectory, that you see a more conflictual relationship, which I think is more or less my understanding of the conventional wisdom in Washington. So putting aside this current moment with the action in Iran and all the ramifications of that, if we went back 6 weeks ago in the lead up to this particular leadership meeting, a lot of the conversation in DC was something along the lines of, we are headed towards a conflictual relationship. At the moment, there's maybe some stabilizing because of the upcoming summit and the future leadership meetings. And whatever happens with that, that's only going to be temporary. There's going to be what the phrase that I've often heard is the snapback back to the more conflictual relationship. Are you endorsing that? Are we locked into that path regardless of what happens in Beijing and possibly in a few weeks?
No, I don't think we should make that assumption, precisely because everything is being destabilized. And if you look in both the Democratic and the Republican parties, there are important currents of thought that would really push against that kind of militarization, the kind of confrontational policies that the foreign policy establishment, I think, would support. But at the moment, they're on the outside. What the presidential race looks like a year from now, who can say? But I think it is within the realm of possibility that these heterodox currents that would push back against kind of unthinking reassertion of American primacy, they could gain significant power in both parties, and that would open up different possibilities. But I think it is fair to say that where the kind of establishment elements are right now presages a much more confrontational relationship.
Maggie, so you are our trade expert on today's panel, and you, of course, spent a number of years at the Commerce Department before your current role with our project and with the Center for Strategic International Studies, just kind of honing on the trade component in this narrative of maybe there's been a stabilization of ties over the course of the past year since the Chinese reaction to the Liberation Day tariffs last April. Sometimes you hear a terminology of a trade truce. So my question to you is, are we currently in a trade truce? What are the terms of that trade truce? And if the summit proceeds, is that trade truce possibly going to be further solidified, or should we expect something else?
Thank you. Thank you, Neysun, and it's great to be here with this esteemed panel with all of you. So it's always hard to follow Jake, but I think he keyed in on some really important aspects of this, and I was going to do the same thing, talk a little bit about where we were, where we are now, and where we could potentially be going. So if we look back to last year, as Neysun started with, Trump came in and there were already a series of tariffs in place, right? There were 301 for unfair trade practices, Section 232 for national security reasons, anti-dumping and countervailing duties across a number of sectors. And then what Trump did is he rapidly escalated things. And of course, we all know how that played out in terms of China's response. U.S. tariffs went up to 145% on China. And then over the course of the year, we saw, as Jake said, these periods of escalation and then de-escalation, ultimately culminating in the Busan summit. And again, as Neysun said, coming out of that is this so-called fragile truce. And what that essentially means is coming out of that, the U.S. lowered tariff rates to an average of 47% on China. China, in return, paused a number of its export controls. As we remember, they were on rare earth elements, metals, and magnets, among other things, that had serious repercussions for critical sectors in the United States, including automotives and our defense industrial base. And so China paused those for a year. They also agreed to do things like slow the flow of fentanyl precursor chemicals and buy more agricultural products. And so I would say, yes, this fragile truce has remained. I think we can, getting to the next part of this, where we are now, we can point to reasons why, and that's because Trump's attention has shifted elsewhere, right? It's gone to Venezuela and now currently in Iran. And so I want to pick up on two big factors I think we need to discuss. And one is the war in Iran and the implications that has for the global economy, as Jake said, and importantly, energy. And then the second, the Supreme Court ruling on the use of the International Economic Emergency Powers Act that the Trump administration used to justify its tariffs. That is significant, I think, for a few reasons. They're trying to make up these tariffs with a few different paths, including new Section 301 investigations, but essentially that undermines Trump's ability to at will use tariffs as a threat in the same way that we saw over the last year. So as the trade person on the panel, I'm going to give a couple statistics because I think the other thing is at this point, we can now evaluate the impact of tariffs and this trade war, as well as the war in Iran on the U.S. economy, as well as China. So goods from China to the United States are down 30%. So in a sense, the tariffs have worked. But on the flip side, U.S. goods to China have dropped by 24%. And in terms of agricultural goods, they've dropped by 66%. So we have, a number of constituencies in the United States that have dramatically been affected by this, not to mention the fact that Americans have borne the brunt of the tariff costs, as we know. Meanwhile, China has now strategically diversified its trade. It's buying 90% of its soybeans from Brazil, increasingly also buying large amounts from Argentina. And its outbound trade has in fact grown over the last year by 8%. So of course, China has economic issues that I know that we're all aware of, but in the United States, we're facing higher inflation, higher food prices, higher gasoline prices, and all of those economic pressures are going to be important in this context of going into this summit. On the point about Iran and the energy crisis, around the world, countries are facing this, many lower and middle income countries, but also allies like Australia are starting to think about energy rationing if they're not doing so already. China has been relatively insulated and I think is feeling quite confident for a number of reasons, but including many of the energy security measures it's taken over the last few decades. Renewable energy build out for sure, but also coal reserves. So on my final point is looking ahead to the summit. And we've heard from recent meetings between Ambassador Greer and Secretary Besson and their counterparts about this idea of a board of trade, a board of investment. I think, as I understand it, the board of trade is a little bit more thought out, and its idea around managed trade. So Ambassador Greer specifically mentioned things like agricultural products, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and energy, which would include coal, oil, and gas. And on the Chinese side, that could mean things like low-cost consumer goods and other commodity items. I think these are largely U.S. ideas, so I'm not quite sure how China is thinking about this. And I think there's some skepticism about government overreach in terms of determining where exactly we'll be trading. But I think in terms of coming to the table and seeking stability above all else, it may make sense to pursue this path in the interim. On the investment point, my understanding is that this would be around discrete investment deals as opposed to broad policies around investment, which, at least coming from Washington, there's a lot of questions about Chinese FDI in the United States and what a framework could look like. But I think at this point, it's a little too early to tell how that may shape up. So in conclusion, I think, yes, a trade is likely to continue at some point before it expires, because I think both parties are coming to the table with stability in mind.
It's really interesting. I think with both you and Jake, your initial interventions naturally are very different than they would have been 6 weeks ago. Obviously what's going on in the Middle East is roiling the landscape. But I'm going to try to kind of go back to that conversation, as you did towards the end of your remarks, of if we can put aside, obviously it's just a heuristic to kind of try to do that. But let's put aside the implications of whatever is happening in the Middle East right now. We just go back to the way we were talking about this trade truce 6 weeks ago. Yes, for sure, the element of, the possibility of Chinese FDI in the US was a big part of that conversation. But another part of the conversation was this notion that both sides think they're winning in the trade truce. And if and when either side figures out that they're not winning, that the trade truce will collapse from there on out. And I kind of want you did speak already a bit to this issue of, Chinese FDI in the US, but I wonder if you could say something about the second point. Is there a scenario where whatever they come, if they meet, so one, hypothetical, if they meet, and two, if they come to another level of agreement, is in a way, it's a variation of the question I asked Jake, is the underlying tension towards something more conflictual, is it so built in that eventually whatever truce it is falls apart, or is there a more hopeful vision?
Sure, I'm happy to. It's hard to put aside what's happening in the Middle East, but I will try. I think at the end of the day, both sides learned last year that they could successfully inflict economic pain on the other. And there's a question of which country is willing to withstand more. And I think we learned quickly that the United States is not willing to withstand a lot, particularly in an area like rare earth elements, where China has a strong chokehold. And if anything, the goal is to buy time to help reduce dependence on these critical supply chains, particularly from the U.S. perspective, with supply chains running through China, but also in China. I think China, though, is quite confident that it has done a lot to insulate this itself, including in dominating so many of these supply chains, particularly in the clean tech sectors, but also, as I mentioned before, as we're seeing with the energy crisis. So I think there's an element of time, and in the near term, working towards this stability or trying to maintain some kind of truce, we'll continue to use that word, while understanding the ultimate plan in the end is to continue to de-risk to the extent possible.
And probably on both sides, both the US and China are de-risking from each other. So Maggie Lewis, again, it's going to be hard to set aside the implications of whatever's happening in the Middle East for the question I'm going to pose. And so I can't even ask you to disregard it. But ultimately, what I'm curious about is what, as a scholar who has spent a lot of time in Taiwan and thinks a lot about the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, what are the implications of this particular moment in U.S.-China relations for Taiwan? There was talk, again, this is maybe becoming outdated by the minute, but 6 weeks ago in D.C., there was some talk of, was President Trump eyeing some kind of a grand bargain with China that would have implications that those who are mindful of Taiwan's status would find troubling. That was a concern in DC, and I know you've been part of those conversations as well. So how does that look to you right now? What do you think the Chinese might try to get President Trump to say about Taiwan if and when he visits? Do you think he'll say it? And more broadly, what is the way in which this most complicated issue is going to look like in this period ahead?
Thanks, Neysun. I'll start with Taiwan and then maybe add on a few things with fentanyl and whatnot that's been kicked around. The less that Trump says on Taiwan, the better. That's my sort of bottom line. I expect that Xi will say a lot about Taiwan because no president is going to go to China without hearing how important Taiwan is to China. But that's fine. That's part of what happens. But the issue with Trump is we don't know what he's going to say on any issue from 1 minute to the next. And Beijing knows that too. So, I hope that U.S. declaratory policy towards Taiwan, which is built on decades of, it's sort of like the Jedi text. There's the 6 assurances and there's the Taiwan Relations Act and there's all in the China, and I really do pity the person who has to try to sit down with Trump and explain this to him, because I doubt he has the patience to absorb it. But at the end of the day, I think Xi Jinping and others in Beijing know that Trump is going to say whatever Trump wants to say. And so even if he does say something which is out of line with current declaratory policy, will that stick and hang on? That's the other question. So, but the less he says, the better. I think right now, I mean, Taiwan, and I'll be there in a few weeks and hopefully catch the front end of mango season. But I think it's also important to recognize how messy, I was listening to Lola Young, but Taiwan is kind of messy right now domestically too. And so this is complicated in Beijing, it's complicated in DC, it's complicated in Taipei. And that is, there's a very fractured domestic landscape right now in Taiwan that also is making this hard. So Lai Ching-te is president, but he came in without a mandate and his popularity has been fragile. He has the executive branch, but not the legislative branch, which is held by the KMT. The KMT's chairwoman is currently on the ground in China, expected to meet with Xi Jinping later this week, which is going to be interesting to watch. The third major party, the TPP, the head of that party, who's the former mayor of Taipei, was just convicted on serious corruption charges and was sentenced to 17 years. We'll see how that maybe adjusts on appeal. The Constitutional Court is barely functioning at this point. And this makes it hard in Taiwan to get a consistent messaging from that government, as well as to really work on what they need to work on with increasing defense spending, but also more generally the push for resilience. And that's not just about having the military hardware, but having the 23 million people really able to think about what do they need to be able to do and survive if there's a cutoff in energy, if there's some sort of quarantine blockade, whatever could come their way. But what I'm hoping is that, whatever happens, that basically that Trump and Xi do not say much publicly about Taiwan, and that we have just sort of the pedal the bicycle approach as best we can. That's sort of the best case scenario, I think, with Taiwan. Some other issues that kind of play into my wheelhouse of criminal justice and human rights and thinking of security. But, Taiwan is in the first island chain, and there's others. There's Japan. That was an interesting visit to the White House, and Philippines. And there's just also one of the issues now is there's so much activity on the air, on the water, under the water. And it was exactly, 25 years ago today, the U.S. had a couple dozen members of our military held on Hainan Island because it was right after the April 1st, 2001 plane collision that resulted in the death of a PLA Navy fighter and the U.S. plane, the EP-3, making an emergency landing. In hindsight, it is phenomenal how that could be a huge crisis was contained and dealt with in a rapid and peaceful manner. If a similar situation happened today, given the nationalist rhetoric, given the higher stakes, given the activity, I am doubtful that such a collision would be dealt with in such a measured and ultimately, it was significant, but it was a diplomatic resolution. So I'm worried about security issues, not just Taiwan, but in the air, water around it. And then thinking too about some of the transnational security issues, fentanyl is still in the mix. It was about a decade ago that the U.S. DEA first recognized that the PRC was the major source of fentanyl and fentanyl precursors, because of course it's also going back into what it takes to make the fentanyl. It's still, very much on the agenda. I think it's a little less so, in part because fentanyl overdoses in the US have gone down. So it's not quite as much in neon lights. And that's partially because there have been efforts to cut the supply side and to make it so there's less fentanyl. But it's also harm reduction efforts in the US and a lot better access to the overdose drugs so that people are not dying if they overdose on fentanyl. So that's still there, but I don't expect that in the forefront. We do, though, also see, even coming out of the Department of Justice, indictments for issues like money laundering, which in part are connected to fentanyl and drugs, but also human trafficking and sort of other bad things that are done. And I'm kind of interested to see how much on the law enforcement side in the US and the prosecution side, they will continue to have these fairly high profile indictments of Chinese actors and not, I don't think Trump's going to address that, but can that kind of continue as putting pressure on both with these money laundering, fentanyl, drugs, and transnational repression, which is an issue that the US government is paying more attention to, not Trump himself. And then just finally, I don't expect to hear anything about human rights, in part because the Trump administration has been very clear they don't care about human rights. Also because I think there's very little the US can do on a macro level to change what's happening within China with human rights. But even on a micro level, we had at the end of the Biden administration, 3 Americans who were in a prisoner swap brought back to the United States, having been held for a long time in the PRC. And we sent 3 Chinese nationals over. But there used to be much more of a, here's a list of people the US government thinks is being wrongfully detained or imprisoned in China. And that the appetite for that on the Chinese side has definitely gone down. So there's a lot less of that sort of, here are cases we care about. Can you do something about them? That would in the past have happened at this level of interaction.
Great, Maggie. I feel like I overstated my initial suggestion to not talk too much about the current moment in the Middle East, because I do want you to say a word about that, because there is a lot of speculation right now as to what is the way in which the deployment of U.S. forces to the Middle East and the focus that seems to be reasserting itself, what are the implications for Taiwan's defense if we keep going down this road? And I feel like I should ask you to say a word or two about that.
So there's already a huge backlog of stuff that we said we're going to send to Taiwan for its defense, which is part of the Taiwan Relations Act, right? And so that backlog, I worry, is going to get even greater. So we had at the end of 2025, another big arms package going to Taiwan, but there's a long pipeline between saying these things are going to go to Taiwan and them actually ending up on the ground. And the more stretched the US is, and the more that we're using things in the Middle East that could go to Taiwan, yeah, that is concern. And there's also just a larger concern about US shipbuilding, sort of the general sort of what is the preparedness of the US military if it is going to continue to be this major, presence in the Indo-Pacific. And I'll say too, I spent a lot of last year in Australia, which has been interesting to follow, because for Australia, China is both its biggest trading partner, but also a source of great concern, in part because, hello, who was in the Tasman Sea? Hello, PLA Navy, right? So there's, I think it's too that, this sense of it, the more the US has a protracted, and we'll see how protracted it is. Again, Trump might decide that mission accomplished and we're done in Iran. But if that's protracted, that we do start to play, how much can the US do at once? Can we walk, chew gum, do a song and dance all together? So that is worrisome overall for sort of the presence. At the same time, I recognize the sort of, I believe very strongly in international law, and that's where I'm the rules-based international order, international law is the thing. There's customary international law, there's treaties, law of the sea. And the more that we have the US not just be dismissive of international law, but flagrantly violate it, that also opens up a lot of opportunities for China to do many things outside its border and just be able to shrug and say, well, the US already did that or did that too. So I think that part of what's happening in the Middle East is about the further erosion and even breaking of norms and laws that have been exceedingly important to keep stability, not just in one region, but globally.
Of course, that references back to Jake's opening remarks at the start of the discussion. Rosie, so a piece of the overall picture that you've been focused on is the question of not just people-to-people exchange, but in general, not just people-to-people exchange in general, but more specifically student exchange and the pathways for American students, American postgrads to study on the ground in China, especially in non-STEM fields. Your organization, the U.S. China Education Trust, just published a report, a working group report on investing in greater American knowledge in China that Maggie Lewis and myself were part of. And we've discussed earlier today here at Penn. When we were in the process of putting that report together, there was this notion that the summit could potentially be an opportunity for that issue set, that the two leaders might make some kind of statement about student exchange. So maybe that's still on the table. Obviously, the summit is delayed, and there's many hypotheticals in that respect. But what is your take sitting here now, and thinking also about the reception to the report that was published just not very long ago, maybe a week or so ago? Do you think that this is a moment where that issue can potentially progress along the lines that you're hoping for, and could the summit be a useful stepping stone towards that?
Well, thank you, Neysun. It's a great question, and I can't go further without thanking you and Maggie for your great contributions to the project, which just went out recently, and folks can take a look on the USET website if you want to see a copy of the report. Well, I think it's a really interesting question. I will say, I think when the kind of standard list of topics that might be included in the summits, if indeed they take place, come up, tariffs and fentanyl and Taiwan are the kind of often bandied about topics. People-to-people exchange hasn't really been on that list, but I think there's a very good reason it should be. The state, just to kind of zoom out and give some context to where we are now, and maybe even to zoom out a little further, kind of where we were under the last administration. People-to-people ties between the two countries really took a nosedive during the pandemic. Global travel and connectivity was halted overall, but the U.S.-China relationship in particular really fell apart during the COVID pandemic. Flights basically halted between the two countries. It was extremely difficult, physically to get back and forth. But also student numbers kind of crashed on both sides. The pre-pandemic to post-pandemic numbers of Chinese students studying in the United States is down 1/3 from where it was in 2019. And the US drop off in American students studying in China is much more acute. And the low points of the pandemic, there are around 300 Americans on the ground in China. And we're now back up to 2,000, which looks great by comparison, but still in the overall picture, 2,000 Americans, that's not a lot of people on the ground. And we argue in our report that it's just insufficient for the US need in the years ahead, whether it's in business, government, academia, or anything else. So the kind of the general landscape of people exchange, I think, should be giving policymakers more cause for concern than I think that they're currently taking. There's a kind of I think maybe an assumption that people-to-people ties are this, stabilizing force in the relationship, this ballast that will kind of remain even when geopolitical ties go south or run into issues. But I think what we've seen very acutely over the past 5 years is that is really not the case. The people-to-people ties are very much downstream of these bigger geopolitical tensions, and as things continue to not feel well in the national bilateral relationship, individuals are feeling that pressure as well. So during the last administration, there were kind of some more acute pieces that really prevented ties from getting better. One of them was the level 3 travel advisory the United States had on travel to China. So in very practical terms, that meant that many US study abroad programs or traveler programs wouldn't run to China while that level 3 advisory was in place. And as the Biden administration was leaving office, that has gone away. So on the kind of that structural side, things are maybe taking a half step forward. But just a reminder of where we were a year ago, an enormous amount of confusion and lack of clarity from this administration about the status of Chinese students in the United States. So around this time last year, we were getting notices that the Trump administration was going to be aggressively revoking Chinese student visas. Institutions like Harvard had a lot of questions around whether they're going to continue to host international students, many of them being from China. And within that landscape, we saw an enormous amount of uncertainty around the fundamentals, if and how you can spend time with a person's country and whether you're going to be able to, if you come here for a program, spend your whole 4 years here without being sent home. So this is an area that's really ripe for, I think, a reset and could really be an important point of restabilization in the relationship if it is indeed added to the agenda. So that's kind of where we have been and where we are now. I think we're seeing a much kind of more stable moment in the U.S. China people-to-people relationship. Flights are kind of ticking back up. Travelers are going forward. One thing we may see out of the summit is visa-free travel for Americans. That could be an interesting outcome. In earlier this year, when the prime ministers of the UK and Canada went, that was a deliverable that came out of each of those summits, 30 days of visa-free travel for Canadians and Brits. So that might be something that would come out. But I will say, I think that if there was what I would want from the summit is an opportunity for both sides to recognize that the people-to-people ties can and should persist, even if the bilateral kind of national relationship is on the rocks. That might look like an endorsement that China knowledge in the United States is indeed valuable, something we've talked about on our report. We think a lot of students right now are deterred from spending time on the ground in China because they think they won't get a security clearance or it'll be challenging for their career in government, where meanwhile, folks in government are having a hard time hiring enough people who know enough about China to staff up their offices. So there's a lot of mismatch here. And I think there's an opportunity here for policymakers on both sides to really kind of double down and emphasize the role that time in each other's countries can play in stabilizing the relationship.
Great. Rosie, when we were thinking about this 6 weeks ago, we thought there were 4 days of summit and the possibility even of President Trump going to Shanghai, maybe even visiting an educational institution in Shanghai. Now the summit is 2 days. Given everything else they have to talk about, are you worried that there's just not going to be time for them to talk about this set of issues? And if that's the case, what happens to this issue set if it doesn't really have time to be discussed in the 2 days that President Trump may be in Beijing in May?
Well, there's a long list of issues and it's going to be hard to cover everything. I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't come up in the 2-day summit, but there are up to 4 opportunities the senior leaders are going to be meeting this year, if you consider G20, APEC, and a potential Xi visit to the United States later in the year. So this isn't the only bite of the apple. So I think that is one thing to keep in mind. But I will say, I think this is a pretty low cost area where a senior leader statement or a signal, whether it's going to an educational campus or meeting a student or whatever it might be, would send a very positive signal to all the different players in the ecosystem. It's not like you can just flip a switch and students come flowing in each direction. Campuses, administrators, individual students, individual professors, individual policymakers, sometimes at state level, legislators have to make sets of decisions that, encourage or empower these individual actors to take that step to travel to each other's countries. So a signal on that level, the highest level, although small and maybe, not a huge amount of the 2-day agenda, I think would help to open up the space and the feeling of encouragement that would help other actors move forward.
Great. Carl. But Carl, you often like to say that your expertise is Chinese domestic politics, not U.S. China relations. But we have found a way to bring you into the cinematic universe of the Penn Project on the future of U.S. China relations. And I think your particular expertise on domestic politics in China is really important for this conversation because both leaders are going into whatever meetings that they have against the backdrop of what's going on in their countries. And so we have the sense, of course, those of us sitting here in the United States, of whatever is going on in our country right now. But what is Xi Jinping going into this kind of a meeting with, from his perspective on what's happening in China domestically? How does that inform what he might want out of a meeting like this, or the sense of confidence or the sense of vulnerability that he might have going into that meeting?
Great, and thanks so much for Nathan, and thanks so much to all the participants. Since I do domestic politics, I'm going to sort of push a little bit on the conceptual framing of what's taking place. And generally, when we talk about things like the summit, or when we talk about things like U.S. China relations, we have a particular framework in our mind. We tend to think of these through the lens of state-to-state relations. Each of these is like governed by it's conceived of as a nation state governed by bureaucratic actors who are pursuing well thought out strategies aimed at advancing the national interest. The term grand strategy is often thrown around a lot. Some of you guys actually are studying government, right? Is that correct? Right? Y'all are government. So anyone taking classes on IR theory and you've done things on realism? Right, exactly. Okay, so that's like the classic narrative that you use to sort of explain international relations. That simply doesn't apply. That we're rapidly departing from that framework. And one thing I'd like to drive home is we're really, if you're talking about U.S. China stuff right now, you're talking about a framework where that narrative just is eroding. Domestic politics is what's driving the show in both countries. And even more specifically, both systems are decaying into something closer to single man rule, with policies that are veering more erratically based on the whims of the top leader. In the United States, this is going to last at least another 2 or 3 years, possibly longer in the case of China. Now, of course, many of you were sort of thinking about China, the United States, and so because we're experiencing quite visible erosion, as Jake mentioned, we're several weeks into a poorly thought out war, that was initiated by a president for unclear aims and echo chamber of cronies, reflecting back what he himself wanted to hear. And we seem to be probably less than about 2.5 hours away from finding through if it falls through on this barbaric threat to end Iranian civilization. That's not the system that's being run by, under anything resembling realist policy, nor is it something that's just the last 6 weeks. This really is sort of a steady decay over a longer period of time of the U.S. political system. Now, all of us who are sort of absorbed in the circus-like failings of our political system often find it hard to sort of imagine what's taking place in China. But it's really important to realize, it's hard to appreciate that China itself has its own version of these trends as well. It's less apparent, it's less erratic, but it's taking place too. Over the past 15 years, China has steadily seen its one-party system erode back into a more personalistic regime. So under Xi Jinping, he has removed or sidelined all of their top party leaders who are not affiliated with himself. He's cowed the bureaucracy with political and anti-corruption campaigns. And just within the last couple of years, but particularly since about January, you've seen this dramatic move against the military establishment, the purge of Zhang Liu-style. Basically, the entire central military command has been taken out. And all of these are symptomatic of a system that is experiencing its own deep problems. Now, many people will try to spin this as like some sort of grand strategy on the part of China. That's not my view. For me, I view this as very much an example of like China's own internal black box politics. As single man leaders have an internal problem associated with it, and rather than see this as sort of some indication of China's strength, I view it as really problematic. So you've got the same dynamics that are experiencing in the States, which is top leaders unwilling to sort of reflect back bad information to the person at the top. I think there's much less grand strategy. It's more coherent in the States, but I think there's much less grand strategy going on than people think. I do think that there's also on the PRC side, on Chinese leadership, I think there is a little more interest in the part of maintaining the status quo, particularly because they don't know what could happen, and that's politically risky in the PRC environment. The idea that China is right now emboldened to take dramatic risks, I think that's a misevaluation of what's the situation is like in Beijing. But if I was going to find the thing I'm most worried about, I'm worried particularly in an environment both of these countries are going in this direction. the possibility of misinterpreting what's taking place on the other side. For Americans, it may be hard to realize that there are some in China who will spin the narrative that everything that happened with Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba is all part of a carefully coordinated plan, sort of aimed at China. Any of you in the United States who think that, you're like, that's not what's happening. But you got to imagine you're in a different environment with different signals. Some people in Beijing can start to spin this as it's all about us. And so what really worries me in the long term, as you start imagining not just what happens now, or the summit, but what going forward, is the possibility that there can be some really truly tragic misapprehensions between the two countries about exactly what's going on, particularly in an environment where expertise is, you know, the incentives are to demonstrate fealty to the top leader, channels of information at the top are eroded. This could be a recipe for some really bad misunderstanding. I'll stop there.
Really interesting, Carl. I just ask you one quick follow-up, just on that last thing you said, where you said that there are some in Beijing who think that the U.S. action in Venezuela, possibly Greenland, Iran, possibly Cuba, is all about China. Jake can confirm or deny this, but I think there's a non-insubstantial number of people in DC who think that as well, and are quite actively saying that this is all about China. I don't know if that's true or not, but is it not the case that there's also a constituency in our country that likes to think of all of that through the lens of this is all about countering China?
You know, you can't. I don't think you can spin the actions of the current government as going in that direction. I mean, I think Trump is far too erratic, but I do think that there are, or in the United States, there's a perception that sort of China is our great. And this is not, yeah, it's not Trump, but this is. Some would say that China is our greatest external adversary, and we need to be prepared to respond to that. And that's exactly the same thing you hear in reverse from some in Beijing. And particularly in an environment where decaying, I think there is a decaying ability in both countries to carefully evaluate stuff. There's various domestic currents in both countries that sort of have a spin towards amplifying that. That's not a good environment to be in.
Great. Well, we've got a lot of ideas on the table. We definitely want to take questions from all of you. You'll see our student intern, Isaac Hoban, up there with a microphone. If you'd like to ask a question for anyone on the panel, just raise your hand and Isaac will bring you the microphone. And also for those of you who are watching online on Zoom, we can also work in your questions. So if you would like to put in a question in the Q&A function, we can also take that. So let's first see if in the room anyone wants to ask a question. Gabe.
Thanks, guys. Many excellent points. My question is to Carl. I'm Gabriel Wildow. I do China political risk advisory. So like I said at Neyson's last event, I just steal all these points and use them with my clients and take credit for them. But my question is for Carl. What do you think is the best recent example of President Xi not getting or appearing not to get good information or acting upon bad information? I mean, for me, maybe zero COVID would be a pretty obvious example. So I kind of want to cheat by ruling that one out because it's too obvious, and it's now 5+ years ago. Is there anything more recent where we could say gee, that really doesn't make sense if you have if you're getting good information?
I think we should really some more recent. I think sort of the locked-in economic strategy on industrial manufacturing, inability to sort of pivot back towards domestic consumption. There's a range of things in there, but I mean, basically, look at the last 5 years, the 5-year plan. I mean, they really are doubling down on a very particular narrative. When many of the economists that I follow, they'll be like, look, I mean, this is not really going to. It has a range of negative effects. And yet, if your goal is to be, you want to be the manufacturing superpower, you can keep driving forward. So but I think zero COVID is even better. But if you didn't want that one, ought to be something else.
Thank you. I think I saw a hand here.
Thank you all for being here. I'm Peyton. This is a question for anyone who wants to take it, because I think you all have different perspectives to answer this question. But I think there's a lot of kind of speculation in the US and in Washington about what China's intentions are long term, what China wants, particularly like in relation with the US and the broader world. So I'm wondering what your perspective is on China's goals for regional hegemony or global hegemony, whether or not China's kind of ambiguity on that question is strategic on purpose, or if there isn't a clear consensus, and to what extent is US opinion on that question perhaps overblown.
Yeah, this is a really important question because it has really dominated thought in Washington. But I think it is rather the outcome of a set of conclusions that are driven more by American insecurities and often the projection of Americans who themselves exercise global hegemony and therefore assume that everyone must want the same thing, than it is a careful assessment of what China's behavior indicates. I think that China would be very pleased to exercise regional hegemony, but they also think that's a wildly unrealistic goal. And the Chinese leadership, I mean, I certainly agree with Carl that Chinese leadership is stuck in a certain set of ideological positions. It has sort of core commitments about party rule and the importance of maintaining the legitimacy of party rule, the importance of suppressing any competitors within the system. Those I think are the core motivations of the party leadership, and the obligations or aspirations abroad flow out of that. To try to seize regional hegemony would be extraordinarily destabilizing in the region, internationally and domestically. And I think, once you take into account the set of commitments that the leadership has, or that I just mentioned, they are pretty pragmatic about how they pursue their goals. So I think they're smart enough to realize that trying to dominate the range of other, like, just think about the region. We're talking about Japan, which is extraordinarily powerful militarily if it ever decided to use it. We're talking about India, the biggest country in the world. And then you get a little bit further, you have Philippines, which is obviously closely connected through the U.S. alliance. You have South Korea, which is very prosperous and willing to assert its own autonomy. It's simply not in the realm of possibility that China could establish power over these countries. Now, Taiwan is a very different question. Taiwan is part of one of the fundamental ideological commitment of Chinese nationalism, and China would be willing to go to war if it felt that that claim were in serious danger. But the idea that it would establish influence over these other countries, I think, is not something that they're considering. Although they do want deference to their priorities on, again, the internal, what they define as internal priorities, which is the power of the Communist Party to rule China, the territorial integrity of China and national sovereignty. These are the core issues for China. So the Chinese leadership does engage in pretty flagrant coercion when it feels that those issues are under threat. But the idea of trying to exercise regional hegemony, I think, is not something that the party is pursuing, and certainly not global hegemony. And that is reflected in the Chinese response to the way that Trump has ripped up a lot of the vectors of American influence around the world. There's all this kind of like hand-wringing in Washington that, oh no, China's going to step into the vacuum and gain all this influence. And we don't see that, actually. China has more or less maintained the direction it was on before the second Trump administration started. It has not tried to seize the forms of influence or soft power or leadership that the United States has turned its back on.
Just before giving it over to, I think, Maggie and then Carl, I want you to just follow up a little bit on when these questions are asked, sometimes they're phrased in terms of, does China want to be the hegemon or the regional hegemon? And sometimes and I think your answer to that was the first part of your answer. And then the second variation of the question is, to the extent that the U.S. has also played the role of like global responsible stakeholder, does China want to fill in that space, which is linked to, but also different from the hegemon question. So for example, if we're not giving development aid, is China going to fill that space? If we are not going to, do peacekeeping in a certain place, does China want to fill that space? And like, I don't want to see if you just want to say one more word or two about that part of it, because I think that gets lost sometimes in the hegemon question.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because I think the way to think about American hegemony is that the United States was not just trying to like dominate the world because it loves domination or something. The United States had an idea that there was a global system that worked for American interests and that worked for interests of everybody everywhere else. And if we could integrate everyone into that system and just sort of get rid of the handful of small countries that were challenging it in some way, and those are the rogue states and like terrorists, so North Korea, Iran, Iraq before the United States attacked it, and Myanmar and Sudan. So a handful of these sort of like global villains that were the focus of American military efforts up to about 15 years ago. And then everyone else would be integrated into that system, and that system would maximize prosperity. It would maximize human freedom. Like this was the mission that I think the sort of foreign policy establishment of the United States understood themselves to be pursuing. And then over the course of about the 2008 to the 2015, 2016 period, all of that seemed to fall apart. And all of a sudden, like we were at the end of history, and then all of a sudden, no one was going to be a Democrat anymore. No one was going to accept American power anymore. Everyone was using the state against the free market. Like these sort of like core commitments of on the American side, the ideological commitments of the American side, all of that seemed to be falling apart. And I think in Washington, that had to be explained somehow. And more or less, China is the explanation that came in for that. And it wasn't a good explanation, but it did provide kind of an organizing focus for American foreign policy to both explain why we were facing these setbacks and to reestablish unity of the foreign policy establishment itself over what we need to do. And then the question is, does China want to roll like that? And the answer is no, definitely no. And again, you can see that the way that the United States has alienated all these different countries around the world, has ripped up the U.S. aid and all of the humanitarian programs. China has not stepped in to take over that role. You even see it in places that would be more directly in the self-interest of Chinese economic interests. There have been suggestions within the Chinese system to pursue kind of a green development initiative that would extend financing to countries around the global south to be able to purchase Chinese exports of clean energy. That is something that has been suggested in the Chinese system by people who have influence, but the Chinese government has not shown much of an appetite for that, coming out of the setbacks that the Belt and Road program faced after its experience of really expanding in the 2010s. So I think, I think we also should not rule out the possibility that eventually things will get so bad that China, to secure the interests that are important to the leadership, which are primarily domestic, will feel that it needs to exercise a more assertive external position. But they're not, and this is basically the road that the United States traveled from the 1920s until it established global hegemony in the 1940s. The United States didn't want that role in the 1920s. And eventually, because the external environment became so hostile to what the American elite understood as core interests, they eventually asserted that role. So I don't think China is anywhere near that desire now, but I don't think we should rule out that they might feel themselves forced into that kind of a role. But then we need to really look closely at how they understand what they're doing, which is going to be different than the way that the United States understood what it was doing.
Maggie.
So a point on Taiwan and then a point to follow up on Jake. So with Taiwan, there is no doubt that what Xi Jinping and the leadership wants is for the first time ever, the People's Republic of China to have control over Taiwan. We all know that, right? The questions, and there's no doubt too, the capabilities are increasing to do that, though that's not just necessarily a linear increasing of capabilities, especially given all the turmoil in the ranks of the military, which could, is creating a lot of challenges, at least in the near term. We'll see how that plays out. But of course, capabilities are not intentions, and we don't know what, there is no timeline, there is no, set pace, but Beijing is doing I think, a very conscientious job of trying to shape the environment for an eventual goal of unification of Taiwan. And in part, that is in the messaging. And so a shout out to Jacques Delisle and his work, and Bonnie Glaser and others, on how UN Resolution 2758, which is the resolution that gave Beijing the UN seat and ousted Chiang Kai-shek, Republic of China, and how there has been a very deliberate effort by Beijing to recast that as trying to say the UN has accepted China's one China principle, that Taiwan is part of China. So there's a lot of effort going into that, right? So with the norms generally, of course, Beijing is projecting outwards, whether it's island building in the South China Sea or support to small island nations in the South China Sea that's helpful for them to have. And more generally, when we think of international norms, we speak oftentimes in terms of rule shapers, breakers, or takers. And China historically was a rule taker. Right now, the US is doing a great job of being a rule breaker, but China is increasingly a rule shaper, and that's also through things like the Global Development Initiative, which has the friends of the GDI, that's at the UN, and the Global Security Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative. So I think there is a definite concerted effort to say, we are helping to shape international law, which is not static. It does change. That's what international law does. And that's in a high level, but it's also getting into the inner workings, the bureaucracy of the UN, and the way that you actually get these norms put into a lot of documentation. And it's not exciting, but it's happening. And I think it's something that we need to pay attention to.
Get another question.
Okay. We have one back here. And just a reminder to those watching online that I am checking the Q&A function. So if you don't want to ask a question, just type it in the Q&A function.
Hi, my name is Caleb, and thank you guys for sharing your thoughts on U.S. China. My question is for Margaret. Just now you mentioned that Beijing is trying to shape the environment for eventually absorbing Taiwan. And I was wondering, with the recent travel of KMT President Cheng Li-wen to Beijing, do you see that as that goal kind of coming to fruition?
She just got there, I think, today our time. Now it's tomorrow already. So I'm hesitant to say how it's going to play out than to what Nanjing and Shanghai at this point. But so in 2015, we had Ma Ying-jeou, then president, met with Xi Jinping, emphasized the Xi Jinping of 2015 is not necessarily the same as the Xi Jinping of 2026. It is relatively new, had not consolidated power in the same way. And of course, after no longer being president of the Republic of China, Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou has been back in a personal capacity. But this is a big visit, and I'll be interested to see both what happens with the visit itself, but even more so, how it is received in Taiwan. And we're looking at local elections in Taiwan coming up later this year, which are very much more on local issues because it's mayors and things like that. But then January 2028 is not that far away for the next presidential election. And we'll see who the KMT puts up. But the KMT's got a good shot. The DPP, not only is Lai Ching-te not a very popular president, but the DPP has been in already for 12 years. That would be 16 years. And when you talk to the Gen Zers and everything, they're kind of tired of the DPP with good reason. There's a lot of things to complete. It's not just about cross-strait relations, right? It's about working conditions in Taiwan. It's why there's barely anyone having babies, why the pension system is really expensive, the healthcare system. So I think there's a lot of dynamics going on here. So I'll look for some signals from this visit, but I'm really interested in January 28. I feel like, Carl, you want to say something? You're nodding. No.
Good.
just want to really strongly emphasize that the way that from the United States, we often look at other countries' domestic politics through the lens of our foreign policy obsessions. And if the Kuomintang candidate did win, that would not indicate that Taiwan wants to rejoin with the mainland. That would be the sort of knee-jerk response in Washington, would be like, oh my God, they've given the whole thing up. This is horrible. That's not true at all. There is no widespread desire within Taiwan to rejoin the mainland. And so unless the mainland is willing to force the issue through violence, we're a long way away from that outcome.
Well, if we don't have another question, oh, well, we do have a question from online. That's very exciting for me that we were able to really make this hybrid. So this is a question from Trudy Rubin, the longtime worldview columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, one of our great friends here in Philadelphia. So she asks two questions. One, how do you think Xi Jinping regards the usefulness of China's relations with Russia and Russia's war with Ukraine? And the second is, how do you think Trump's war with Iran will affect the visit to Beijing? And I think the presumption of that is that the visit, well, maybe it will affect it not happening at all, but if it does happen, what would be the effect? So those two questions, who wants to tackle one or both?
You go first.
You start.
No. I've done something.
Okay. I'll start, I guess, by building on my comments before with regard to the second question. And I think the war in Iran certainly will affect. I think we've talked about from a security standpoint how that might influence the view from China on the United States in terms of where Trump is focused, which is not in the Indo-Pacific right now. But I think it also gets back to the energy and economic consequences of this war. I've read some analysis in terms of is what is China gaining from this? And I think if it was up to China, that this wouldn't have happened. I don't actually think that they're seeing this as a big win for them. And I did mention before that they're fairly well insulated from the energy security piece of this, but that's only to a certain extent. They still do rely on oil from the Middle East. It is still oil is still 20% of their energy consumption, and it's not just about the power sector. It's obviously about chemicals and many other industries. And so I think their assumption has been up until this point that any kind of conflict in the Middle East that would affect energy would, they would be fairly well insulated. But if it goes on for a long time, it's going to affect China just as it's affecting the rest of the world. And so I think all of that will come into play in the context of however this, if this conversation comes to pass between the two leaders, where in the back of their minds, they're seeing Trump kind of act at will, as we've talked about, and breaking kind of this international system that we've had for a few decades now. And that will just all be happening in the background as they are entering into these negotiations.
I can try to take a crack at the Russia component, and I don't, I'm a domestic politics person, so, but my thinking on just on the Russia Ukraine, we tend in the United States we tend to sort of be very much focused on U.S. China, but the world is like a multipolar place, and so I do think that when you're thinking about Russia and when you're thinking about Europe, this is very interesting. When Russia invaded Ukraine, I do think that this was not like coordinated. Putin did show up in Beijing, but I don't think that this was not a coordinated part of China wanting Russia to do this. I think they are unhappy to see that caused vibrations with their relations with Russia, with Europe. And so the idea that this is the Ukraine war is, I think, a problem from China's perspective if it risks the energy in your relations with Europe. And one of the artifacts of the war in Iran is the idea that the United States has alienated itself from its European allies, and then China may take this as an opportunity to sort of try to repair trade relations with Germany and the like. So I'm trying to put those thoughts together. But I do think that this kind of reflects the fact that there are these choices that other actors make that aren't all about the United States, and that will play out in the politics of different countries. So I'll stop there.
Professor Jalil.
I want to pick up a little bit on mostly Jake's comments, which is, but it's for all of the panel. How seriously should we take the impact on allies and partners' confidence in East Asia? That is, people in that part of the world, their confidence in the U.S. commitments, given what Trump has been up to and has said, and how big a problem is that for the regional dynamics? And then a little more focused primarily to Maggie on the Taiwan front. In Taiwan stock and trade, and thanks for the shout out, but Taiwan stock and trade has been appealing to norms in effect, right? Good citizen, good democracy, all of that. That doesn't carry much clout with the current administration, and the inability to get special defense budget. There are a lot of factors that seem to put Taiwan in a especially precarious position. So I invite you to further comment on that if you want.
Yeah, and it's like ice pick through my heart that we're saying that these norms of democracy and human rights and individual freedoms don't matter in the conversation. But I think people in Taipei have gotten the message pretty loud and clear that what matters is transactional. Okay, what are we doing with the fabs in Arizona, and how are we going to have more, and what are we doing with the tariffs? And I think at least, the people we know in Taiwan, that they care greatly about their democracy. But my sense is that it's very much understood that that is not a message that's going to resonate with the Trump administration. I hope that just means that this is a hitting the pause button on those conversations. That said, the more that you don't have norms in the forefront, the more I worry that they're going to fade for the long term. And just more generally with friends, partners, allies, that how durable those relationships are when you have, like, thinking to the recent visit of the Japanese prime minister. I mean, to see a joke about Pearl Harbor. No, I mean, it is painful to see that level of what we had was such, we've had such strong relationships with Japan, with Australia, with Taiwan, and I really don't know. But the longer this goes on, the more those relationships are going to fray, and we're going to have a lot of work to do to build them up again. So I don't know what others, but worked on it.
I think diplomacy is a very performative endeavor, and American allies are always going to put on a show of wringing their hands about this and that. The United States is not paying us enough attention. We're losing confidence in the United States. I think the allies in Asia don't have another choice. They don't want to be under China's power. And likewise, for all the theatrics of Trump's rule, if you look at the leadership, not Hegseth, but the policy leadership at the Pentagon, there is a really bedrock commitment to alliances in Asia and building up the U.S. position in Asia. And I think that there's going to be some tensions with how that plays out, with devoting so much resources to Middle Eastern wars, as well as with the kind of the performative ways that Trump is undermining those relationships. But ultimately, I think that the U.S. will continue to support the military alliances, and the allies can continue to rely on American power to back them up. And it's more, I guess, the thing that I worry more about is where the U.S. China relationship goes, and that's really going to determine how those alliances, whether those alliances are stable and maintain security, or whether they get drawn into some kind of escalatory cycle where the alliances themselves could be a contributing factor to some kind of terrible conflict.
Just to reinforce your wording just now, in today's Wall Street Journal, Yaroslav Trofimov, the chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, has a piece which described as tied to an increasingly erratic U.S. allies in Europe and Asia see the bond breaking, but have nowhere else to turn, which, I'd laugh, but it's not particularly funny. Okay, so I think we probably have time for one more question from either online or Zoom. If not, this will be our last question.
I'm July Amador from the Philippines, and I would just really like to emphasize the point about how you view things in not only in China but in our countries as a reflection of your domestic politics. Because this point exactly about who do we want to dominate us, and we have no other choice. The question is the answer is we don't want anyone to dominate us, and we have to do these formative games to keep the US engaged to balance China as it needed. But the reality is, even in Southeast Asia, there are some countries that are more confident of their own position than the others. And the recent Institute for Southeast Asian Studies survey shows that half of Southeast Asia has shifted to a more China-aligned view. So in that sense, some of them feel that a partnership with China is something that they can deal with. So I would say that there should be also confidence that some of these countries do not want any other country to be dominant. They actually find ways to resist China. And some of this you do not see on media, because once again, these are diplomatic practices that may be off the record or something that they don't reveal. But there is enough confidence if you go around the region to be able to say that Southeast Asia is, looking at all of these developments, and we are also generally not happy with just looking at Taiwan as the main issue for us. Is that if you look at Taiwan and say, well, that is US foreign policy, but what about us? Nobody wants to tie their foreign policy to what happens to Taiwan, regardless. So I just want to provide that perspective from Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Well, I think that point is very well taken. And I mean, I think the reality is China's not going anywhere, right? And we had a foreign policy that I think Jake outlined that kind of implied that maybe China was going somewhere, pushing it, like kind of what does the US want and how can we get China into that corner? And I think that where we are now is potential for a reset with the summits and the engagements coming up this year of in the absence of anything else, what kind of stability can these two global powers demonstrate on the global stage that will assuage the fears of those in the region or elsewhere, that these two enormous and very important superpowers can take their relationship and manage it seriously and to do so responsibly. And I think even that, I mean, I don't want to set the baseline expectations too low for the summit, but that would, I think, send a pretty powerful signal to the rest of the world, given the, the backdrop we've just laid out.
Great, we're just about out of time. On the spirit of what Rosie just said, I'm going to just ask lightning round, just write down the panel. Do you think the summit's going to happen May 14th and May 15th? Jake, you're first.
It's not fair before we see what happens after the deadline. Because if we go full scale war, then I think no. But if we don't, then I think yes.
I mean, I agree with Jake. It's a little too early to tell. I'm skeptical that it will happen. But I also know that there's more opportunities later this year. So in that sense, if it seems that the United States is still fixated in the Middle East and doesn't have the time to do the careful preparations that the Chinese side would also like, then I can see either a postponement or the summit not happening.
I'm not really a betting woman, so but I think Trump really wants to have it happen. I think there's desire to have it happen. Maybe we'll get down to 1 day, or maybe it'll be like 1 hour. I don't know, but I think there will be a meeting. I don't know if it'll be exactly those dates.
I agree. I think it will happen. I think that there's a desire on both sides for this kind of symbolic win of the two sides meeting. I think another delay would dampen that impact. So I'm putting my bets on it happening.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'll happen. I think the Chinese will only want it to happen if we know exactly what's going to happen. And so that's all dependent on whether or not there's actually enough time to sort of hash out what the content would be.
Well, the framing of today's discussion was anticipating. That's a capacious term. So maybe we're anticipating in May, maybe longer, but I cannot thank you all enough for coming to Penn today for this discussion. It was really terrific. And this is, to be honest, the first time I can remember that we have brought different generations of our project fellows to campus for an off-cycle meeting, not related to one of our workshops with our project fellows. And so that's been really a delight to kind of bring you all into our community. And that was made possible by our partners, the Government and Policy Association and the SNF Fidea program. I'm really glad we were able to do this. Thank you all for joining here in the room and online. And we will conclude the program like this. Thank you all.